Hello, I'm Matt Carpenter, and this is the Good Life Podcast. Hello, we are back with the Good Life Podcast. I am Matt Carpenter, and I'm pleased today to have my fellow elder at Trinity Reformed Church and good friend Jason Cherry. Jason has written a book called The Culture of Conversionism and the History of the Altar Call. So, Jason, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
The question of why we have altar calls is something I never asked when I was in a church that had one. It was very common. It was ordinary, but your book is helpful in that it gives us not only how churches have done things in the last 200 years, but also you begin with talking about how things were well before 200 years ago, going back to the Reformation and even before that. So let's start off though just with the initial term, which may throw some people off, conversionism. How do you define conversionism?
Well, when we talk about conversion as Christians, we're on a basic level, we're just talking about how someone becomes a Christian. And on a more theological level, Protestants tend to define conversion as faith and repentance. Conversionism, however, has a much more narrow definition of conversion, and conversionism, as I use the term, has really a couple of features. One feature of conversionism is that it takes the conversion event and places it at the center of the Christian life. And so everything else outside of that conversion event is secondary if it matters at all. And it's this crisis conversion event that's at the center of the Christian life. And so anything else, whether you're talking about an understanding of theology, pursuing virtue, understanding how to live the Christian life, all of that is drained of meaning and urgency and energy in conversionism. What matters is, have you had a crisis conversion experience? And if you have, then the other things are optional. And the second feature of conversionism is that it's a crisis conversion. So the idea of a Damascus Road experience is the normative definition of how you become a Christian. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about a child who's raised in a Christian family in a healthy church, or if you're talking about some hardened sinner who late in life turns to Christ. The conversion process is much the same for each of them. Kind of this crisis conversion, this Damascus Road experience.
So, in your book, part of your point is that this crisis conversion, the necessity of a crisis conversion is not and has not always been with us in Christianity.
That's right, and it's really a very new thing, and you can kind of trace the development of this in terms of Protestants going back to the Reformation. So if you go back to the early church, in the medieval period, or just, the first 300 or 400 years of the church, the action of becoming a Christian, it was not assumed that it was a Damascus Road experience. It was not assumed to be a crisis conversion. They were really operating under a basic catechumenal process, which is just referring to this kind of nurturing, this intentional nurturing of children raised in the faith. And the idea was that you're raising these covenant children, you're shaping their faith and their habits and their thoughts and their actions and their feelings, and they are growing into the baptism they received as infants. And so you've got stories of dramatic conversions. You've got the Apostle Paul, you've got Augustine's story of his own conversion, and some other notable figures in the early church who are not raised in a Christian New Covenant community, who have these moments, but that's not really the normal way they viewed conversion. And then as you move into the medieval period or the late medieval period, of course, we see the development of the sacerdotal system, which is just basically the idea that saving grace is transferred to these individuals through the 7 sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church, and all of that was really ironed out by about 1200. They had the 7 sacraments, and so as long as you go through the 7 sacraments, then you receive the grace necessary to be saved. And of course, in response to that sacerdotal system and some of the abuses there and some of the wrong ways they were defining the process of becoming a Christian, of course you see the Reformation come about. And when you get to the Reformation time period, one of the things they're looking at is this very thing. Is how should we understand how someone becomes a Christian? And so when you look at what Luther's doing on this question in terms of conversion, Luther's doing what most of those people that come after him in the Reformation want to do, and they want to separate conversion from the sacerdotal process. And so for Luther, the process of becoming a Christian started with infant baptism, and it was followed by this catechetical instruction during childhood. It happened in the home, it happened in the church. And for Luther, once the child reached what he called the age of discretion, then they were supposed to make a public profession of faith. But it wasn't this big dramatic thing. It was largely a family and church process. And so you have that developing with Luther's theology. But what quickly happens for the Lutherans there in Central Europe is the process of working up to that profession of faith became very intellectualized. And so you saw this sort of reaction to that with the German pietists. So you've got Frank and you've got Philip Jacob Spener coming along, and German pietism is born, and what they're doing is they're saying, well, yes, that doctrinal knowledge is good and everything, but really the person needs to make a personal and emotional confession of faith. And so you go from Luther, and you've got the German pietists, and then you've got a figure like Martin Butzer, who was German himself, but his influence was spread far beyond just Central Europe. And what Butzer is doing is that process of making a public confession of faith. Well, Butzer also wanted it to be public. He wanted it to be heartfelt. He wanted that faith to be expressed during a confirmation process, where there was something of an interview or a process of determining that this person has a minimal amount of doctrinal knowledge. And really, it's a classic evangelical thing that he is wanting to see out of these people. And mainly it's children raised in these covenant homes.
Can I interrupt?
Yes, sir.
Just ask a question briefly. So the idea of one publicly declaring, I am a Christian, making a public profession that would be the end result of a confirmation period. That did not begin with Luther, though, did it? I mean, that was going on before the Reformation happened. Yes.
Yeah, a lot of these things are just kind of a shadow version of what was happening in the Roman Catholic Church in the late medieval period.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not. So Luther did not just come up with, or Butzer or the Reformers say, we need a public profession where this 12 or 13-year-old is now doing this. And I would add, it's also that was required, even though most of the Reformed churches, or all the standard Reformed churches at the time practiced paedo baptism, most of them did not allow communion until confirmation.
That's right.
So there was that, and then since Butzer was a sovereign grace thinking reformer, Calvin, though, how did John Calvin, was he like Butzer in this? Was he somewhat distinct, or what was the?
I think Calvin was closer to Butzer on this than some of the other figures. But yes, Calvin, of course, is wanting a personal confession of faith that's beyond just reciting some doctrinal knowledge. He is wanting that. But Calvin is largely following Butzer's influence on that.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, right, because Butzer had quite a bit of influence on Calvin.
Yeah. But one of the things that's unique in that Reformation period, the spectrum of Reformation groups is pretty wide. If you've got on the one side, one extreme are the Anabaptists, and let's say the other side of that spectrum is the Anglicans. But what's really interesting is that the Anabaptists, of course, they're requiring a profession of faith. Of course, they've got their own spin on it because, of course, they're saying, well, baptism can't happen until this person has a profession of faith and kind of works through, their notion of conversion in their prescribed way. But even the Anglicans in the 16th century and 17th century, they also wanted a personal confession of faith. And they're emphasizing this. And you can even see this in Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress.
Yes.
He's got basically a sinner's prayer of sorts in there that's very heartfelt, and this is representative of how they wanted to see a child being raised in the covenant community. And I think the thing that matters here is as the different Reformation groups are emphasizing the personal confessional element. That's a good thing. That's classic evangelical thinking. It's where the idea of a personal relationship with Jesus comes from, and there's a lot of good there. But one of the interesting elements there is that personal confessional element was featured in all of the Reformation groups, even when they disagreed with each other on a lot of other things. And that's what's setting the table for when American, the colonists coming to the New World, and you have this kind of American evangelical doctrines developing. They're taking those common developments and they're then going to do something with it.
Okay.
And make it Americanized. And that's where I think this conversionism culture comes from.
So whatever Europe does, America does 3 times more. And we think it's certainly much better. So, okay, so we skip from that, talking about the background, which is helpful information, to now we're looking at the early elements in the United States of revivalism.
Mm-hmm.
So could you talk about what was revivalism? How did we get it? And this, of course, includes the First Great Awakening, which is going to plant the seed, or maybe you could say second generation. If the Reformation was first generation emphasis on these things, and it's not literally following generation as on like a timetable, but the next thing we see is the First Great Awakening and the rise of revivalism. So talk about how that pushed the envelope a little further.
Yes, and so if we're talking about revivals and revivalism, one way to define revivalism is just these outpourings of the Spirit in a great degree. And so you've got people who need to come to Christ in large number, and then they are coming to Christ in large number. And so that might be the broadest way to define revivalism. And of course, that then has expressions in the First and Second Great Awakening that are similar, but also very different. And so some people have looked at a lot of people have made a distinction between revival and revivalism. And I'm thinking here of maybe Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones and Ian Murray, his assistant and biographer and historian. And one of the things they've done, and I think it's helpful here, but it's not an exhaustive help. What they do is they say is, well, revivalism is when man is trying to stir up the Spirit with these certain methods. And revival is a more authentic work of the Spirit. And then what they want to say is that the First Great Awakening is a real revival, and the Second Great Awakening is just revivalism. And I think there is some truth there, but it's not the whole story, because I think it's better to look at the First and Second Great Awakening not as contrasts, but as building on each other in such a way that the Second Great Awakening and all its excesses would not have been possible without the First Great Awakening. And so really the First Great Awakening is just paving the way for what we then see in the Second Great Awakening. And so if you take what's at the heart of in that First Great Awakening and some of that revival or revivalism moments in the First Great Awakening, what they're doing, and think about Edwards and Whitefield and the big names that most people know, they're taking the essence of Christianity and they're locating it as an experience in the heart. And for Whitefield especially, at his events, this would lead to large numbers of very dramatic, very emotional conversion experiences.
And Whitefield himself was a very dramatic, perhaps too dramatic, preacher. Just from some of what we hear, I remember the story not Abraham Lincoln. It would have been good for him to go to a revival meeting, but for someone like, let's see, Benjamin Franklin, when he went to the Whitefield, he said he would not take money with him when he was at a Whitefield meeting because he would just give it all in the offering plate. So Whitefield was a passionate speaker and a good dramatic preacher. But it's possible for people who are very dramatic to elicit things from the public that may not always be God's Spirit.
Yeah, and when they're that emotional, they can be temporary. And with Whitefield, I think that one biography of him was called The Divine Dramatist, and I think that's exactly right with Whitefield. He wanted to be an actor. He had acting skills, and he often ended his sermons in tears. And the thing to note, though, is it was very authentic with Whitefield. If you've read about Whitefield, this is who he is. He's not putting on a facade with this. He's a very heartfelt man. But what he's doing there is he's creating this subjective element that becomes, I would say, the defining characteristic of American evangelicalism to this day, that spans beyond even conversionism and the altar call.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're saying he's emphasizing the subjective element in the hearers.
Yes.
Okay.
He's bringing it about. He's drawing it out of them.
Okay.
Yes, but it becomes, Whitefield is the first celebrity in American history, and so he was seen and heard. Some estimates by over half of the people that lived in the 13 colonies during the First Great Awakening. So his effect that he was having is not small. And it's not just people reading his sermons in the newspaper. Many, some would say most, American colonists at some point heard this man and were shaped. Their understanding of Christianity was shaped by what he was doing.
So the First Great Awakening, one of the things you point out, it was not exclusively it was not led by one denomination. You have Whitefield, he's Church of England. You have the Wesleys, who were Church of England / Methodist. But you also have Presbyterians like Gilbert Tennant.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and then of course Jonathan Edwards.
Yes,
the
Jonathan Edwards. So you have all of these together. So there's a lot of views on how the first, what went wrong. Some people would say nothing went wrong with the First Great Awakening, and maybe, like you said earlier, it may not be wrong, but they were planting seeds, and some of them were not good. So when you're looking at that, you can't just say it's all bad. It's kind of like Jesus' parable of the wheat and the tares. When the farmer plants and then someone comes and sows tares, in the night, and servants say, "Do we need to go try to separate?" And Jesus says, "No, don't." It seems like the First Great Awakening, you have this kind. There are some negative things, and that's a difficult jump for some people in our culture, because I know for me, George Whitefield is the preeminent man in early American history. He's the one that all pastors should aspire to be. When he did a lot of great things, but he was not perfect either. And I know we're not trying to delve into to his flaws, but so he did have struggles. Jonathan Edwards, with whom I have this kind of back and forth. Not love, hate, but really love, and then love not quite so much, and then go really love again. So I really don't know what to do, because he has great points to what he was saying, and then whether it's Edwards or whether it's what has been emphasized of Edwards in the last 40 years, because with the resurgence of the young, restless, Reformed Calvinism, especially with John Piper pushing the Christian hedonism thing, everyone focused on this one part of Edwards, which is, his book on affection. I cannot remember.
Religious affections.
Religious affections.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone emphasizes that, and there's a whole lot more to him. But I think to a degree he is. So I guess at this point I'm defending him, just to be perfectly honest. But he, if you only emphasize that point, I personally think there are a lot of other points that we could emphasize where he stands out much more than just his religious affections treatise.
Yes, and I agree. His book Freedom of the Will, in my mind, is his best book. But one of the things that's happened that I've experienced is in the Reformed world of the last 40 years, right? No one says anything negative about Whitefield or Edwards.
Right.
And it's not that we should be on a crusade to destroy people, but they are canonized as saints for American Protestants. And I've never heard really much critique of either that's significant in terms of their theology or their ministry. But yeah, one of the things they're doing in the First Great Awakening is, there's a lot of good things, but they are, I think, establishing subjectivism as this now immovable feature of American evangelicalism, and that can't be undone. And it's not that there shouldn't be a personal, subjective, in terms of there's meaningful faith in each subject. It's not that shouldn't be part of Christianity, but what I think they're doing is they're largely making that the center of what we now know to be American evangelicalism, and I think that's where the flaw is.
Right.
And the other thing about the First Great Awakening that I want to make sure and point out is that in generic Reformed history, we know those names, but really standing behind, especially Whitefield, are other people that probably we're not as familiar with, like Theodore Frelinghuysen, who was one of those early leaders in the First Great Awakening. And one of the things he does is he's advocating for conversion-based Christianity, and he's taking some of those elements in the European Reformation, emphasizing the personal confessional necessity in development of a Christian. But what he does is he defines conversion with a very specific 3-step process. And this is where you start to see this American cookie cutter requirement for conversion. And so for Frelinghuysen, he defines conversion with these 3 steps. First, individuals must publicly admit to violating God's law. Second, they must testify to a conscious experience of the new birth. And then third, their life is supposed to result in pious living. And of course, all those are good things. We look at that and say, that's all wonderful. But what he's doing is he is very narrowly saying, until I see these things in the way I'm outlining them, the church can't declare for sure that you're a Christian.
Right.
And then Gilbert Tennant comes along, and he is basically taking what Frelinghuysen is doing, and he's doing something similar. And what Tennant contributes is he's really saying we have to have an outward sign before the church can say for sure this person has become a Christian. And that usually had to be a very dramatic or emotional or a certain type of formulaic testimony. And so what Whitefield's doing then is Whitefield's got these incredible oratorical gifts, but he's taking a lot of this narrowing of the definition of conversion and he's applying it to the masses with his gifts. And so I'd argue that standing behind Whitefield are those two men and what they're doing, really narrowing the understanding of conversion, and in the process combining with Whitefield this kind of the subjectivizing of American evangelicalism.
And something else I would add also that and this is, it's not the point in your book, but something to just be aware, that people should be aware of, is that early America was already we were 13 colonies. We were diverse, and the First Great Awakening did not help ecclesiology at all. It did a number on the loyalty of people to their local church because, see if this sounds familiar, someone says, well, instead of listening to my pastor who's dry, I can listen to Whitefield or Tennant, and even in some cases, some of those, and I'm not accused, there were other Great Awakening preachers besides just those in Frelinghuysen, but some actively encouraged people to leave their local church if that local church did not support the work of the Great Awakening, First Great Awakening. So this is not helpful for the unity of the faith.
No, and I think two things go hand in hand here. You've got the undermining of the local church, like you're talking about. Often Whitefield's preaching out in fields because the local church won't let him in. Obvious, sometimes it's because the crowds are so large, but they wouldn't allow him to preach in a Church of England building, for example, in some cases. But you've got the subjectivizing of Christianity and the undermining of the local church, and I think those are mutually reinforcing things that are still features of American evangelicalism today.
Right, right. It's not left. So that's just something for listeners to keep your eye on whenever you're looking at these things, because it's not a focal point in the book, perhaps in the application, but that we'll get to later on. But the seeds for being more loyal to a celebrity teacher or preacher than loyalty to your local church has been in these United States from early on.
Indeed.
Now, boy, we could get lost here, but you also cannot, I don't think, underemphasize the relationship of the First Great Awakening and the rising of democracy and individualism from the American War for Independence, which comes along very soon. I mean, it is within, what, 20, 30 years of the First Great Awakening?
Yeah, so 1740, let's say, if we're going to to 1770, so yes, a lot of the people that were alive in the First Great Awakening were alive during the War for Independence.
Right. So, is it possible for you to just talk briefly about what are some things in the First Great Awakening that contributed to the American War for Independence, or to the thinking that gave us the American colonial, patriotic, anti-British mindset?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of things here. It's hard to say what causes what.
Sure.
In my mind, and maybe there's been some good work on that can definitively prove this, but I think there's several elements of the colonial culture that are all happening within about a 100-year period that shape not only the political stuff but the religious stuff, like the First and Second Great Awakening. So you've got the rise of liberal democracy, for example, and so we're Americans, so we love liberty, and the American value of liberty, I guess we would trace it back to the Mayflower Compact, 1620, those separatists, and they agreed to form a civil body politic. So you've got self-rule, and so I guess you could say that's the seeds of it, though that you probably couldn't draw a direct line from that to say the Constitution. But the point is, you've got this notion of liberty early on, but also one of the elements of American culture that's in the 17th and 18th century is there is a fear of Roman Catholicism that's mixed in here, and this may contribute to individualism and liberal democracy as well. And a lot of these colonists who are coming over, they're living in the long shadows of the European imperial wars, and those wars, at least in their minds, were tinged with religious overtones. I think I would argue that really those wars probably weren't as religious as the typical history books suggest, but in the minds of a French Huguenot who had just fled, they were. And so, however historically accurate it is to say that they were religious wars, in the minds of many American colonists, there was a religious overtone to the imperial wars happening in Europe. And so they feared, I think, Roman Catholicism. You've got the French Huguenots, they come over, they settle in upstate New York, and then they settle in South Carolina, and they grow those communities, and they're very religious communities. So you're kind of sowing these seeds where you're distrustful of Roman Catholicism. So that's a part of American culture that's kind of a part of the backdrop to a lot of this. You can fast forward to, the eve of the War for Independence. The fear of Roman Catholicism is illustrated when, in April of 1774, the British Parliament passes the Quebec Act. And the Quebec Act returned French civil law to 70,000 French-speaking citizens in Canada. It gave them the right to practice Roman Catholicism, which was no small thing in an English-governed territory. But also what it did was it expanded Quebec's borders down into the Ohio Valley. And that was a problem because in 1763, the proclamation of 1763 said that the colonists could not go into the Ohio Valley to settle. And so this also riled up people's fears against Roman Catholicism. So I'm throwing that in there because I think that's part of the story when you're talking about the growth and development of liberal democracy. But liberal democracy in America doesn't begin when Cornwallis surrenders his troops at Yorktown. It's not like just all of a sudden American liberal democracy is born. There's political developments, there's constitutional developments, and they're all feeding this sort of individual religion that becomes a hallmark of American Christianity. But even in the late 1700s, there's still a British mindset. there's still, they still see the world as hierarchical. They still see, there's patricians and plebeians. In other words, there's a class system of sorts. It might not be nobility like in England, but it's it's the planter class, and then the poorer people, and then there's this patriarchal dependence that kind of runs through the strata of society. So there's still those inherited elements from British society, but the seeds of liberty are there, and it's the seeds of liberty that you see expressed in the individual subjectivism in the First Great Awakening, and it's all developing over time.
So we move then from the First Great Awakening. So you have it 1740 to 1760s or so, correlating with the French and Indian War going on simultaneously. Then the War for Independence, where you see, admittedly, a downgrade in religious participation. And I don't remember who published these, but I saw the statistics once on out of wedlock births about the time of the American War for Independence had gone up. So there was people were seeing a problem in the morality practiced by many. So then after the war, we eventually, we have our independence, and then you early 1800s, you see the seeds that come of the Second Great Awakening. So talk about what was the Second Great Awakening, and how we really start seeing the rise of the classic altar call and conversionism.
Yeah, and underlying so much of that is that notion of individualism that you just mentioned, and that is developing during this time period. And so I think the rise of individualism is playing out both politically and religiously at the same time in the late 1700s and early 1800s, and a lot of it is coming out of the War for Independence. You've got, in the political arena, the American colonists fought against, in their minds, the oppressive and hierarchical authority of the British government. In the religious arena, the colonists, though, were also shifting away from Calvinism. And, so we can't define Calvinism exhaustively, but in Calvinism, God is the final determining factor in salvation. But that was being displaced in favor of Arminianism, where the human will, the human subject, was the final determining factor in salvation. And I think there are parallels to be drawn here, because in the hunt for political independence, they cast off the king. They cast off King George III. But good Christians, in the hunt for religious independence, they can't cast off the heavenly king. They still have to claim that God is their heavenly king. So they're saying, well, we still maintain our allegiance to that king, our heavenly king. But then theologically, they're putting the supreme authority in the human will. And I think one word to describe all of that is just confusion. I think there's a lot of theological confusion happening as they transfer from Calvinism to Arminianism during the same time period.
So they don't have guardrails. I mean, so they're in some way set up for a further downgrade theologically.
Yes, and that's exactly what's happening during this time. And there's this Baptist named Elias Smith who in 1819 said this. He said, "We must be wholly free to examine for ourselves what is true without being bound to a catechism, creed, confession of faith, discipline, or any rule excepting the Scriptures." And I think that right there explains so much coming out of the War for Independence and now applying it to what we see now in history as the Second Great Awakening.
That explains a lot of I'm not saying he was weird or cultic, but that explains a lot of the heretical groups that came out of the Second Great Awakening. They had the exact same view that we're going to defy what's been handed to us historically by the church in the creeds and confessions, and we all want to read our Bible as individuals.
Yes. That's right. And you mentioned earlier, the guardrails come down, and that's why you see in upstate New York, the burned over district, when you have radical subjectivism applied to religion, applied to Christianity, and there's no guardrails, this is where you start to see the birth of new religions that are often parading around as Christianity. So we've got Mormonism, and we've got some of the other
Jehovah's Witnesses.
Jehovah's Witnesses. You've got several different groups forming during that time period.
Right. So, the name most often associated with the Second Great Awakening is Charles Finney. Now, he did not do this by himself, but he's a significant influence, and you give him a lot of attention in your book. So tell us about Charles Finney and his contribution to what we have today.
Yeah, and so this is really where we should start to think some specifically about the altar call itself. And of course, so the altar call, as most people probably know, but it's just when the minister, usually after the sermon, calls people forward to be saved. And there's usually a process there, depending on what faith tradition is using the altar call, but the person has to come forward. In modern times, that means signing a card that was innovated by a man named Wilbur Chapman. He basically invented the decision card that is still in use today in conversionism circles. Sign a card, you pray the sinner's prayer, which most people who've been to church more than several times could probably recite the American version of the sinner's prayer, and and then the minister presents you to the church as this person has been saved. So that's an altar call. In some of the earlier forms, it was called the anxious bench or the mourner's bench, because what they did was they would set a bench at the very front, and the person who came forward would be sat on the mourner's bench, and there would actually be a counseling session there. And I would say actually this is far better than what it became, because there was actually some pastoral attention being given to the person. Now, it was in a very condensed amount of time, so it probably wasn't sufficient, but at least they were getting some spiritual counseling on the mourner's bench or the anxious bench. So you've got those developments of the altar call before Finney, and a lot of people think Charles Finney invented the altar call, but he is not the Edison of the altar call. If you go back in history, and I detail this in the book, the first altar call may have happened in 1740s, and I say may because I think the historical record on that particular event is a little dicey, but certainly by the 1770s, there's things in the historical record that sound very much like an altar call. People are coming forward to be saved, much in the process I just described. And so that's happening largely in camp meetings, in the early stages of the Second Great Awakening. So the early stages of the Second Great Awakening is the late 1700s. Camp meetings in what they called the frontier, but think like Kentucky, just kind of going down into that area. And so they're having things like the altar call. And one of the key developments before Finney, but that Finney then exploits, is by a man named James McGready. James McGready, who was a Presbyterian, but he innovated the notion of having a datable conversion experience. And that continues on in American culture. Like when you talk about someone being a Christian, they feel like they have to tell you the day they were converted. And Matt, you've done a lot of membership interviews. I can't tell you how many times I've done a membership interview with someone, asked them just, hey, tell me about how you came to Christ. And they almost feel like they have to apologize because they can't give me the date.
Yes.
So this still lives on even for people who've never been in a church that practices the altar call. But that is a unique innovation by James McGready, and it's stuck. And what McGready did was he took what Frelinghuysen and Tennant did and Whitefield did, and he then said, but you've got to have a datable conversion experience. He had 5 proteges that he groomed and sent them out with, this is what you have to emphasize when you're doing these altar calls. And so that starts to spread. So when Charles Finney comes along, he's working in upstate New York originally in the 1820s. He comes to faith as a young man. He was trained to be a lawyer. He had incredible gifts, charismatic gifts, but he also had authority. When you read the descriptions of Finney, you can tell he had a presence, and that he had this charismatic effect on people. He was tall. He was 6'2", so for his day and age, that was a tall man. He was attractive. He had these china blue eyes. He just had this presence, and that no doubt was part of his appeal. But he was a very intense man, intense with his emotions, and so he starts using this altar call method to great effect. Mass numbers of people responding to it. He starts traveling around, and so his ministry lasts for a very long time. He starts in the 1820s as a young man, but he's still going full bore in the 1860s. He starts colleges and the Reform movement, so he's the central figure of the Second Great Awakening because of his outsized influence. And he starts to make the altar call normative, and you start to see the altar call relocated from just a revival, a special event, to now being practiced more so in a local church week by week. And that's slow. I mean, that it takes generations for that to become the assumed expectation. But you start to see it relocated into local churches because Finney was so successful, and who wouldn't want to replicate that success? And Finney argues in his book, Lectures on Revival, he basically says, listen, if you're a pastor and your church isn't having revival, you're to blame. If you want to have revival, here's what you do. And he gives them the list, and central on the list is how to do an effective altar call.
So I remember I was a teenager. I was 18 before I visited a church that did not have an altar call. And I was very surprised. It was a Presbyterian church. It was a PCA, but they were this is PCA now 23 years ago. Pastor was very conservative. This man, I mean, it was essentially a liturgical service. And it was very impressive, but they didn't have that at the end, and I thought, what do they do? How do people become Christians here? Because they didn't. He just gave a benediction, and that was it. So, also, with Finney, I mean, his training as a lawyer helped him because he knew how to argue cases. He knew how to lock down every component, every part of a case, arguing it, trying to persuade a jury to make a particular choice. So he used the same methods in preaching, that you make sure that there's no avenue left for this person. But then I know you mentioned in his later ministry, when they stopped having as many conversions, and when he would call people to come to the front if you wanted to become a Christian, then he made another innovation in order to encourage, let's say, put it nicely, to encourage people to come. So talk about that.
Yes, and so by that point, everyone had walked to the front and been saved many times. There wasn't that many people in these areas. They'd all been to these revivals before, and after a while, people stopped responding to the altar call. And this was a problem because Finney, at this point in time, in the 1860s, he'd written publicly. He was a seminary professor. He'd founded a seminary. And so they're not responding. That means it's not effective. It doesn't work. Remember, who's to blame?
Right.
If people aren't coming forward? It's the minister's fault. So in January of 1868, Finney introduces a new subtle twist on the altar call that has continued on in the American altar call tradition, and that is where he basically made it such that everyone in the room eventually is going to have their hand up or be standing up for some reason or another. And so, he says, if you've already responded, you stand up. Or, so he'll flip it, or he'll call on those who are willing to take a stand and commit to Christ publicly for some particular cause to stand up.
Right.
Or eventually you start to see the innovation of what's called the rededication.
Yes.
For someone who maybe had walked forward at an altar call 20 years ago, but now they're not as excited about Christ as they used to be.
If you want
to rededicate your life, then you can come forward and we'll basically just do it all again. And this is where most people who have been in the culture of conversionism, they've not said the sinner's prayer only once.
Right.
They've not been saved only once. They've been rededicated, and gone through this process maybe several times. And that's a built-in feature that largely comes with Charles Finney.
I remember, so I made a public profession of faith, was baptized when I was 7. And I remember thinking at one point, when I was a young kid, not very long after I'd been baptized, I need to rededicate my life. But I don't know that I've waited long enough, because some of the people I see rededicating their life have already, it's been a while. So it actually crossed my mind, I may just need to rededicate my life once every few weeks, but I'm just going to do it between myself and God. So, thankfully then, eventually I read Luther in his 95 Theses, where he said, we are called to live lives of daily repentance. So, good news for Christians, we get to rededicate our lives every day.
Yes, and that's the thing, is that largely what the typical rededication is just someone who needs to repent of sin. or maybe just a particular direction of their life. And that should be a pretty ordinary part of the Christian life, repenting. We should be the repenters, and this is regular in Christian life.
Something that occurred to me also when I was reading is calling people forward at the end of a service. It was not a new thing in the history of the church, but it was not in the past for the first 1,500, 1,600 years of Christendom. It was not coming forward at the end to be converted. You were called forward to take the supper. You would come forward every week for, in many cases, until the medieval period or so. They would have communion every week, and they would come forward. So coming forward was not a new idea, but the point of it was new. Whereas in the past it was you come forward to receive the gifts of Christ, which was a sacrament, and historically the church, Roman Catholic, Protestant, they all take that as a sacramental gift. But now, when the American evangelicals divorced the church largely, they didn't divorce the church from the sacraments, but they largely stripped the sacraments of any sacramental power. Even in Baptist circles, most Baptists don't use the term sacraments.
Oh no, it's an ordinance.
It is an ordinance only. You even see that in the London Baptist Confession calls it an ordinance. All the other confessions at the time, the Savoy Declaration, the Westminster Confession, and the 39 Articles of Anglicanism, they're sacraments, meaning that they confer God's grace. But what is unstated in these altar calls is the conversion, what they're calling people to, is a sacramental act.
Yes. And several have pointed this out over the years. I think E. Roll Holson, one of his books, makes this point that yes, it's the new sacramentalism. That you can't strip away the sacramental needs of the faith. And so since we've said baptism's that thing that doesn't save you, the Lord's Supper is that thing we do quarterly and we don't even really know why, and it certainly doesn't transfer grace to you.
Right.
So then what have we done? We've replaced it with this altar call, or the culture of conversionism, notions of conversion. And yeah, it's basically the new sacrament, because if you don't do it this way, datable conversion experience in this certain cookie-cutter way, you're not saved. Well, what does that sound like? That sounds like the Roman Catholic sacerdotal system, and what we would all say is the abuses of the sacraments in the medieval period.
Yes. You have sinner's prayer. If you've not, said it, then there's a problem. And now, of course, there's a lot more we could get to, but we need to move on to some of the applications for today. But there were people like, I think, John Williamson Nevin, who wrote against the anxious bench. He even has a book called The Anxious Bench, where he talks about the problems with Finney's measures.
That's right. And Nevin, so by the 1840s, so the Anxious Bench came out in 1843 or 1844, and J.W. Nevin was basically one of the public opponents of Finney, and there were several who looked at Finney's measures, and of course Finney was denying original sin and had a lot of theological problems where he was there was a lot to find wrong with his theology, and Nevin was one. But Nevin had two, I think, really insightful critiques of what Finney was doing, not just with the altar call, but with the whole culture of conversionism. And so what you've got with Nevin is, one of his criticisms is that he said, well, when you're calling people forward in this way, what you're doing is you're confusing what it means to come to Christ. You're calling people forward to do this thing instead of calling people to Christ. And he said it's a significant effect on the mind of the person. So that was one of Nevin's critiques of Finney and just the culture of conversionism in general. But one of the other things, and this is, I think, maybe even more insightful, one of Nevin's critiques in that book is he points out that there's really this legalistic tension within the culture of conversionism that he argues it really hinders godliness. And then, of course, 40 years later, J.C. Ryle comes along, and he doesn't do a lot of direct treatment on Culture of Conversionism, but when he does critique it, it is very effective, and he picks up on Nevin's arguments. And basically, Nevin is saying, these people come forward to Christ in this very heightened emotional state. What it does is it's a very shallow thing that's going on, and so you create, even if the faith sticks, and that was not a given, even if the faith sticks, it develops a very shallow faith. He described it as this whirlwind process that does not set up well for someone to grow into a mature Christian. And I think just the facts of history of the culture of conversionism have bore that out. In fact, Finney himself, later in life, admitted, yes, there's a lot of people falling away that responded to my altar calls, and Finney lamented this. So even the practitioners themselves were noticing the problem. And again, it goes back to the subjective nature of it. If it's just subjective and it's emotional, then it can be blown away just as quickly as it came in.
And I want to say that, at least for my own sake, I'm not claiming that Finney was not a Christian, or that he was trying to just make money, or I'm not saying that he's the equivalent of an 18th century or of a 19th century televangelist that he had. I don't know, but he introduced, though, a lot of negative elements. In the Christian culture. So now, we could talk certainly about those who came after. You have D.L. Moody, you have Billy Sunday, and then, of course, the most well-known is Billy Graham. And again, I'm not purposely trying to avoid talking about them, because, especially with Billy Graham, I mean, he had a tremendous influence on Christianity worldwide, and I have no doubt that there's a lot of people who are believers because of his ministry, but they were all following the precedent set by Charles Finney in the Second Great Awakening.
Absolutely. And it is a line. You can draw the line from, when you just look at the big name figures, from Finney to Moody, then to Billy Sunday, and then to Billy Graham. You can draw a line. They're all operating in that same legacy of altar call culture. And yes, and I don't want to be quick to besmirch Billy Graham, especially of those four. He's a very honorable man and has done a lot of great things. But he largely comes in when he starts his crusades in the late 1940s in Los Angeles. He's just assuming the culture of conversionism. Right. He didn't know any different by that point. But of course, what he does is, because of his worldwide fame, is he normalizes it so that by the time you get to the mid 20th century, it is the basic assumption of how you become a Christian in American evangelicalism, even in Reformed churches.
Right. Now, I cannot remember, was Billy Graham a Presbyterian or Baptist? I thought he was a Southern Baptist, but I could be wrong.
I think it changes over time, and I forget. I think he does start with Presbyterian influence, but then eventually works into more of the Baptist circles.
Because I believe he went to Wheaton.
He did.
And I know his wife did. But I do remember, before he died, an interesting interview. He said, he was asked if he had to do it over again, what church would he be a part of? And he said, I think I would be Anglican.
Really? I've not heard that. That's interesting.
Yes. I remember reading that interview. And he didn't go into a lot of specifics. But at that time, I was leaving being a Baptist. I was becoming Paedo-Baptist. And I just thought, that is so interesting, that this man would do that. And if, again, listeners can look it up, I'm sure it's probably somewhere available online, but that he would go with that rather than a more typical evangelical denomination.
Interesting.
So, we've said that these are things that, and I'm in agreement with you, these have all been harmful. The conversionism culture is harmful, but also we would say that we support evangelism.
That's right.
This is not, it's not a question of either. Well, so the story is attributed once to D.L. Moody when someone said, I don't like your methods of evangelism, and Moody supposedly said, I like the way that I'm doing it better than the way you're not doing it. So, so that is a common comeback.
Yes.
For anyone who criticizes. So what is, Jason, the alternative to the culture of conversionism that dominates American evangelical churches?
Yeah.
What is the alternative to it? And it's not just try to remain the frozen chosen and don't tell anybody. So
right, and I'm glad you point out that there is a lot of good qualities there, and I think the best quality of the culture of conversionism is there is an urgency for salvation for people who are lost, and that is biblical and good and right, and we should all have an urgency for that, and it should be a primary part of the church's work in ministry and care. So that is one of the best elements of the culture of conversionism. But one of the problems with the culture of conversionism is it fails to distinguish that not everyone is converted the same way. In church history, the overwhelming majority of people who become Christians inherit it from their parents. They're raised in Christian homes, they're raised in the church, and they're nurtured in that context. And so their coming to Christ is very different from a Damascus Road crisis conversion experience. And so I think that's where we kind of have to round out the critique here, is that crisis conversion can be a very real thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that doesn't exist. The problem is that almost never exists for a church kid who's raised in the church with a good family and a good church. They don't experience crisis conversion like you might see at a camp meeting in the
right.
1790s. They come to Christ gradually. They're part of the covenant, and they're maturing up into that, and that is a gradual thing that it most certainly isn't going to have a dateable conversion experience.
Right. And when we're preaching, because you and I both preach, we alternate every other week at the church. When we are preaching, there is a call usually to people to come to faith, to put trust in Christ. Because like right now you're preaching through Mark, and I just finished preaching on Leviticus, and interestingly, there were actually opportunities preaching through Leviticus to call people to faith. So, and now preaching on the nurture, what it means to bring up children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. So, certainly parents want to hear, what should I push my kids towards? What do they need? Do they need to be saved? Which we would certainly say, yes, they need Christ. Absolutely.
They're born sinners.
Yes.
They need to be redeemed from that.
Yes. And, even if they are, as Paedo Baptists, you and I are Paedo Baptists, we believe in baptizing our children because they're members of the covenant. But just because they're baptized does not mean that we ignore their need for faith. So we encourage our kids to believe.
That's right. And we teach them and train them and nurture them. And yes, so if a child is baptized as an infant, they're receiving that covenant sign. In Pentecost, when Peter is preaching the gospel of the new covenant, he says in Acts 2:37, this is for you and your children. So the children are included in the covenant. They're part of the covenant. So therefore they must receive the sign of the covenant. That would be strange that Peter would say they're part of this, but they shouldn't receive the sign. So it starts with them receiving the covenant sign, and then they're growing into what that is. They're growing up to confirm the truth of God's choosing them,
right,
and giving them that covenant sign. And so the idea for parents, I think it is even in Reformed churches in America today, there is still this idea that our children need to have a conversion moment. And it's very difficult to shake free from the culture of conversionism because it's all around us, even if you're in a church that is a Reformed church. And you see this in a lot of Reformed churches that even practice paedo baptism, where they place a lot of importance on this public profession of faith. It usually goes through a long process, and it's usually done publicly, and then that's how they're admitted into the Lord's Supper. But the problem there is they're either suggesting or outright saying, we're now able to confidently say with the authority of the church that this 12-year-old who's been through the catechism class and is now standing before you is a Christian. Well, what are they doing? Well, they're just playing out of what the culture of conversionism created. We have to say there's a particular time where the church can confidently say they're a Christian. And the problem with that is when you're baptized with the covenant sign, the process of conviction of sin and repentance is ongoing. The process of being convinced of the truth of who God is, that the Bible is His Word, and then being trained in the habits of Christian virtue, it happens in such a way that it's slow and it's gradual. And if you're looking at, say, a 14-year-old that's been in this process, it's almost impossible to say, well, when they were 7, they really weren't converted, but now at age 10 they are. That's just not what's naturally happening. And what's really interesting, too, is there's been some studies done back in the 90s when the culture of conversionism was still at its height, and 94% of Baptist churches were still giving altar calls. And it was a study done in those Baptist churches, and it was showing that even though they were requiring the kids raised in that church to thread the needle of this conversionism altar call experience, to be saved, you have to walk down the aisle and pray the prayer and do all the pageantry of that. Actually, the process of them becoming a Christian, just being involved in the church, going to Sunday school, living in their home with their parents, sitting under the preaching and teaching of the Word and the ministry of the church, they were actually experiencing gradual conversion. But what happens there is the parents start to get really frustrated because they're trying to have a moment,
right,
a dateable moment where we can now say definitively, you're a Christian, when that's not how it naturally happens for most kids raised in a covenant community.
And we never see this in Scripture, Old Testament or New Testament, with kids. We do not see this. And even if we just think about our own kids. You have 2 daughters. I have 4 kids, 3 daughters and a son. Neither of us tell our kids, all right, we're going to raise you in this home. But before we actually before we're going to give you our last name, you're going to have to prove that you want to be in this family and that you are bearing fruit worthy of being in this family. Okay? Now, if a parent does that, any parent who makes a newborn child prove that they should have that last name, you're going to be hauling for abuse.
That's right.
That. Now, again, I'm not saying, do not misunderstand, I'm not saying that it is spiritual abuse to believe that your kids need to be converted. That is not the point. But the grace that is given to them in being raised in a Christian family is real grace.
That's right.
So,
and it's working their salvation.
Yes.
And it might not be instantaneous or sudden.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so,
and I would add to that, not only is that not how parents parent their kids today, even in the secular home, but that's not how the children in the covenant, in the old covenant, were treated. They weren't said, well, you can't have the name of God. You can't be an Israelite until you prove it at a certain age. So for thousands of years, that's not how children raised in God's covenant community were treated either.
Right. So it was expected. You have, for the males, you have the sign. For the females, there's particular washings that they would go through. All of these things. So they would. There's all kinds of symbols that you had. So this was the expectation, and you were only removed if you chose to. If you removed yourself through your actions, and no one ever said, do you have a dateable time when you became a member of God's covenant people? It was just either you're in the covenant or you're not. And I would argue that the new covenant is the same. I mean, they were told in the old covenant, circumcise your hearts. We're told that we'll have circumcised hearts. So where we try to make discontinuity, I believe that there's still overarching continuity.
Yes. And I think those are the right words to use too. And I would like, there's a lot of confusion still in the American church, even in Reformed churches that practice infant baptism, about exactly how should parents nurture their kids. And I think if I could give some central advice to parents who are in that context, you've got kids, they've received the covenant sign, they're being raised in a healthy Christian home, in a healthy Christian church, healthy Christian schooling opportunities, that the main thing we need to do is we need to shake free from this notion that you're supposed to have a dateable Damascus Road moment. Your kids don't need that to be converted. And one of the things, if we could learn some lessons from history, is in the middle of the 19th century, you have Charles Hodge, one of the leading Reformed figures of this time period, and he was critical of the altar call movement, the culture of conversionism. And in 1847, Hodge, who was commenting on Horace Bushnell's book, Discourses on Christian Nurture, Hodge is making the case for gradual conversion, for having a category, a pastoral category, when you're dealing with your kids, of gradual conversion. And so Hodge is interacting with Bushnell, and Bushnell had argued that the ideal Christian conversion for a kid raised in a Christian home is a gradual experience where they're surrounded by the activity of the church, the ministry of the church, the covenant community, living in a new covenant gospel culture established by the parents leading them in the home. And in that scenario, the child eventually works up to, yes, they can make a profession of faith, and that's good, and we should be happy when children profess their faith. But when you look back on it, that profession of faith is not the moment of conversion. It's hard to know when they were converted. That's just one step of many. And so these children, they're raised in the covenant community. Really think of it as your job as a parent is to marinate them in gospel culture, in a new covenant culture. And when you're doing that, there's not necessarily going to be a dramatic or obvious change in the child's life. It's not a hardened alcoholic, repenting of their alcoholism and turning to Christ. They're not being transformed from persecutor of the gospel to preacher of the gospel like Paul was. This is a very different context for them in this Christian upbringing. And so if we can just shake free, parents should feel free to not have to have a dateable conversion experience. The idea is to let's sow faith, let's sow faithfulness, and let's show them and teach them what it means to be a Christian. And by the time they're old enough, they're going to be a Christian, Lord willing.
That's very helpful, because if we as parents give our kids grace, if we give them the sacraments, we raise them in the church, we teach them the gospel, we love them, we discipline them as needed, and we strive to live ourselves a life that they should follow, we can trust God's promises. That, as Jesus said in John 3, the wind, Greek word can mean, wind, spirit, blows where it will. You can't see where it's come from and where it's going. And so I've told many parents, trust the holy wind of God in these budding trees that you're bringing up, in these young saplings, these olive plants around your table. Trust the wind to blow as He sees fit, and don't worry about it. Just lead them to Christ as often as you can, and don't worry. So,
yeah. And I would just say one final thing on this. This is such an important issue, and that is, the reason. There are several reasons I wanted to research this topic and publish this book, but the central theological reason was I was haunted by the high fall-away rate of people raised in the culture of conversionism. We've all seen the statistics. It's very high. And what I'm convinced of, I'm deeply persuaded of the fact that how someone becomes a Christian in the culture of conversionism is directly feeding the high fall-away rate. And this is something, again, that Charles Hodge wrote about. And he observed that the individuals converted gradually within the church in this way we're talking about now, as opposed to just the pressure of some sort of dramatic conversion. But the children that were converted gradually, nurtured gradually, they avoided the high fall-away rates that were begotten by conversionism and Finney especially. So that should be an encouragement to parents.
Yes. Well, Jason, this has been really good. This is really helpful. Again, the title of the book is The Culture of Conversionism and the History of the Altar Call. It's available on Amazon, and if you get a chance, it's on Kindle, it's in paperback. It's well worth your time. It's not hard, but it is very sound in explaining how we arrived where we are, and also at the end some helpful pastoral points for us when we consider how do we raise our own kids. So thanks, Jason, for talking with us today.
Yes, thank you.